a good deal of the public inquiry reflected in this commission has to do with the so-called question of connecting the dots. In your view, from all of your reading and expertise in this area, was the failure to anticipate and prevent 9/11 a failure to connect the dots that were available, or were there too few dots? And if the former, would a different organization have resulted in connecting the same dots that we had in a way that was more productive and constructive?
Well, thank you for that question. I have here a diagram that shows a large number of dots of different hues. And the problem, Senator, is not that we have too few dots, but that there are too many dots and that we cannot identify which of them is significant. In retrospect, it is easy to identify the significant dots. I've got here Mohammed Atta, one-way tickets, paid cash, 4 Arab-looking men in aisle seats. In retrospect, since we know what happened, we can select amongst the various dots, and we will be able to identify those that were important, and if we had known they were important before, we could have taken action. The problem, the challenge, is to find means of highlighting these areas, those that were significant. And there are a number of ways that we can do that. And I don't believe that the intelligence community is sufficiently focused on some of the cheaper ways in SIGINT, cellular phones, and so forth, that would be of help in this area of highlighting what is a countless set of dots.
CIA's Directorate of Intelligence retains some of its original character of a university gone to war. Its men and women tended to judge one another by the quantity and quality of their publications, in this case, classified publications. Apart from their own peers, they look for approval and guidance to policymakers. During the 1990s and today, particularly value is attached to having a contribution included in one of the classified daily newspapers, the Senior Executive Intelligence Brief, or better still, selected for inclusion in the President's Daily Brief. CIA had been created to wage the Cold War. Its steady focus on one or two primary adversaries, decade after decade, had at least one positive effect. It created an environment in which managers and analysts could safely invest time and resources in basic research, detailed and reflective. Payoffs may not be immediate, but when they wrote their estimates, even in brief papers, they could draw on a deep base of knowledge. When the Cold War ended, those investments could not easily be reallocated to new enemies. The cultural effects ran even deeper. In a more fluid international environment with uncertain, changing goals and interests, intelligence managers no longer felt they could afford such a patient, strategic approach to long-term accumulation of intellectual capital. The university culture, with its versions of books and articles, were giving way to the culture of the newsroom. During the 1990s, the rise of round-the-clock news shows and the internet reinforced pressure on analysts to pass along fresh reports to policymakers at an even faster pace, trying to add context or supplement what their customers were receiving from the media. Weakness in all source and strategic analysis were highlighted by the panel chaired by Admiral David Jeremiah that critiqued the intelligence community's failure to foresee the nuclear weapon tests by India and Pakistan in 1998 and as well as by 1999 panel chaired by Donald Rumsfeld that discussed the community's limited ability to assess the ballistic missile threat to the United States. Both reports called attention to the dispersal of effort on too many priorities, the declining attention to the craft of strategic analysis, and security rules that prevented adequate sharing of information. Another Cold War craft had been an elaborate set of methods for warning against surprise attack, but that too had faded in analyzing new dangers, like Arab fundamentalism. Another set of experiences that would affect the capacity of the CIA to cope with the new terrorism traced back to the early Cold War, when the agency developed a concern bordering on paranoia about penetration by the Soviet KGB. James Jesus Angleton, who headed counterintelligence in the CIA until the early 1970s, became obsessed with the belief that the agency harbored one or more Soviet moles. Although the pendulum swung back after Angleton's forced retirement, it did not go very far. Instances of actual Soviet penetration kept apprehensions high. Then, in the early 1990s, came the Aldrich-Ames espionage case, which intensely embarrassed the CIA. Though obviously unreliable, Ames had been promoted and protected by fellow officers while he paid his bills by selling to the Soviet Union the names of U.S. operatives and agents, a number of whom died as a result. The concern about security vastly complicated information sharing. Information was compartmented in order to protect it against exposure to skilled and technologically sophisticated adversaries. There were, therefore, numerous restrictions on handling information and a deep suspicion about sending information over newfangled electronic systems like email to other agencies of the U.S. government. Security concerns also increased the difficulty of recruiting officers qualified for counterterrorism. Very few American colleges or universities offered programs in Middle Eastern languages or Islamic studies. The total number of undergraduate degrees granted in Arabic in all U.S. colleges and universities in 2002 was 6. Many who had traveled much outside the United States could expect a very long wait for initial clearance. Anyone who was foreign-born, who had numerous relatives abroad, was well advised not even to apply. With budgets for the CIA shrinking after the end of the Cold War, it was not surprising that, with some notable exceptions, new hires in the clandestine services tended to have qualifications similar to those of serving officers. That is, they were suited for traditional agent recruitment or for exploiting liaison relationships with foreign services, but were not equipped to seek or use assets inside the terror network. In the early 1970s and 80s, terrorism had been tied to regional conflicts, mainly in the Middle East. The majority of terrorist groups either was sponsored by governments or, like the Palestine Liberation Organization, or militants trying to create governments. In the mid-1980s, on the basis of a report from a task force headed by Vice President George Bush, and after terrorist attacks at airports in Rome and Athens, the Director of Central Intelligence created a counterterrorist center to unify activities across the Directorate of Operations and the Directorate of Intelligence. The Counterterrorist Center had representation from the FBI and other agencies. In the formal table of organization, it reported to the Director of Central Intelligence, but in fact, most of the center's chiefs belonged to the clandestine service and usually looked for guidance in the head of the Director of Operations. The center stimulated and coordinated collection of information by CIA stations, compiled the results, and passed selected reports to appropriate stations, the Director of Intelligence and analysts, and other parts of the intelligence community or to policymakers. The center protected its bureaucratic turf. The Director of Central Intelligence had once had a national intelligence officer for terrorism to coordinate analysis. That office was abolished in the late 1980s, and its duties absorbed in part by the Counterterrorist Center. Though analysts assigned to the center produced a large number of papers, the focus was support to operations. A CIA Inspector General's report in 1994 criticized the center's capacity to provide warning of terrorist attacks. Subsequent chapters will raise the issue of whether, despite tremendous talent, energy, and dedication, the intelligence community failed to do enough in coping with the challenge from Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda. Confronted with such questions, managers in the intelligence community often responded that they had meager resources with which to work. Cuts in national security expenditures at the end of the Cold War led to budget cuts in the National Foreign Intelligence Program from fiscal years 1990 to 1996, and essentially flat budgets from the fiscal years 1996 to 2000, except for the so-called Newt Gingrich supplemental to the fiscal year 1999 budget and two later smaller supplementals. These cuts compounded the difficulties of the intelligence agencies. Policymakers were asking them to move into the digitized future to fight against computer-to-computer communications and modern communication systems while maintaining capability against older systems, such as the high-frequency radios and ultra-high and very high-frequency line-of-sight systems that work like old-style television antennas. Also, demand for imagery increased dramatically following the success of the 1991 Gulf War. Both these developments, in turn, placed a premium on planning the next generation of satellite systems, the cost of which put great pressure on the rest of the intelligence budget. As a result, intelligence agencies experienced staff reductions affecting both operations and analysts. Yet, at least for the CIA, part of the burden in tackling terrorism arose from the background we have described. An organization capable of attracting extraordinarily motivated people, but institutionally adverse to risk, with its capacity for covert action, atrophied predisposition to restrict the distribution of information, having difficulty assimilating new types of personnel, and accustomed to presenting descriptive reportage of the latest intelligence. The CIA, to put it another way, needed significant change in order to get maximum effect in counterterrorism. President Bill Clinton appointed George Tenet as Director of Central Intelligence in 1997, and by all accounts, terrorism was a priority for him. But Tenet's own assessment, when questioned by the Commission, was that in 2004, the CIA's clandestine service was still at least 5 years away from being fully ready to play its counterterrorism role. While Tenet was clearly the leader of the CIA, the intelligence community's confederated structure left open the question of who really was in charge of the entire U.S. intelligence effort.